Good afternoon, everyone. We have yet another really exciting New York-based panel for you. And I'd like to just invite Diane Davis, who is at Harvard University in their program of urban design. Urban planning and design?
Urban planning and design.
Okay. But they're all transdisciplinary people these days anyway. To start this panel on New York insights and innovations. So Diana, I'll just pass it over to you.
Okay. I mean, maybe, is this working? Yeah. Let me just say that one reason that I'm here, and I'm really excited to be here, it's been a great day so far, is because I'm the project director of one of the more recent projects that the Volvo Research and Educational Foundation has supported on its formal title, Transforming Urban Transport, the Role of Political Leadership. We're really focusing on political leadership, governance, the kind of how things get done, not just what should be done. And maybe after we go through the panel a little while, if there's an opportunity to kind of bring that onto the agenda, we'll try to do that as well, because in several of the panels this morning, I got a sense that people are really interested in the hows. Who's going to get these things done? But before that, my job here is to introduce these four great speakers who are going to be sharing with us their own personal academic as well as practice experience in thinking about innovations in the transportation innovations in the context of New York City. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose a general question to the panel. They will answer it one at a time, ending with Michael, who has some slides. And then I will probably have one or two other sets of questions. We'll see how it goes. We have commentators who are going to be brought up to contribute to the conversation, and then we'll try to save time to open it out to the audience. So the very general question, it's kind of an obvious question, but I wanted to ask the panelists to say a little more about their particular innovation, what they're working on here with respect to transportation or transit innovation in the context of New York. But in addition to giving us some details, I want them to be able to explain to us why we should consider what they're doing to be an innovation. In other words, what is their definition of innovation? How do we know that what you're doing is not just recycled old practice in transportation, planning, design? Is there something really new that constitutes an innovative practice? And then maybe say a little more about how transferable this innovation is. Since the panelists are focusing on New York City, we have people from around the world. Can we move beyond the New York context to understand this innovation? So we'll start with you, Frank.
Thanks, Dan. Frank Hebert from Open Plans. I'm going to talk about it's like a twofer. There's two innovations wrapped up here. I'm going to talk about community involvement in planning bike share. So I don't know how many New York City bike share members are in the house, but excellent, excellent. And maybe members of bike shares in other cities. Okay, good to see that New York is in the lead here. I work at an organization called Open Plans, and we built some open source software to gather community input into the siting of bike share stations. So there's an online map that people could go to on their device of choice and suggest a location where a bike share station should be sited. And this is something that the New York City used in conjunction with a really big community outreach process when they were doing the initial rollout of New York City's bike share back in 2012. And they collected 10,000 suggestions of places where they'd like to see bike share. So that's the first half of this innovation, that they're able to hear from an enormous number of people with a lot of very fine-grained data that they were able to use and pull into the planning process. But they were also able to involve a lot of people who they wouldn't otherwise have reached in that process. The second half of this innovation is that software was all open source. And that means other cities have taken it, reused it, either working with us or just taking it and using it themselves. And so Chicago, Philly, Grand Rapids, a lot of other places, Miami, San Francisco, they've taken this software and they've been able to use it. And each time it's gotten used, it's been improved. And then today, New York City turned their bike share map back on. So you can go to nyc.gov/bikeshare and you can suggest a place you'd like to see the bike share system expand. And that software that's powering that expansion, that's helping gather your input and make it useful, is much better than it was 2 years ago, thanks to the sustained work of each of those cities who've used it since. So it's a double innovation: community involvement at scale and open source software that cities can use and then pass on to future cities better than how they found it.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Veronica Vanterpool, and I am the executive director of a nonprofit group called Tri-State Transportation Campaign. And we are based in New York City, but we actually have a regional focus, and we work on federal transportation policy as well. So we work in New York State, New Jersey, and Connecticut. So our innovation actually is a low-tech version of what Frank is describing. We are taking information and putting it in the hands of the general public in a very low-tech way. And why is that innovative? Because it's not really been done before. So we've taken this information from the agencies, this esoteric, coded, generic information that nobody knows how to read but is available to the public, and we've analyzed that, distilled that, synthesized that, and broken that down so members of the general public have this information at their fingertips and then know how to use that information in advocacy. So a few examples of our work. We've looked at what are known as state transportation improvement plans. And every state in the United States that's receiving federal funds for transportation projects, road, bridge, bike, ped, transit, must report to the federal government how it is they're spending their federal dollars on these transportation projects. States around the country and advocates in these states do not know how to break down this information. We actually did a 50-state STIP analysis, and we worked with advocates in all different states to show them how to break down this data and distill it into a one-page fact sheet that says how their state departments of transportation or their transit agencies are spending money on bike and ped, how they're spending money on road expansion and new capacity, how they're spending money on transit. So we're able to see, for example, in New York, 62% of federal transportation dollars are going to transit, whereas in Connecticut, 27% of transportation dollars are going to build new roadways. And from an advocate's perspective, the value of that is to be able to say, we have these funds that should be reprioritized because the mobility trends in this country are changing, and the funding needs to reflect those changing mobility priorities. So it becomes a very useful tool. It's not as high-tech as crowdsourcing. It's really just as low-tech as putting this information into a downloadable PDF. And when we shared this information around the country, advocates would say, we didn't know how to break this down. We don't understand how to use this data. We don't know where to find this data. And we don't know how to present this data. So in our region, we've been very successful in, again, taking this data and using it as the core of our advocacy work. And it's not just federal transportation dollars, it's federal data sources all around. So we've looked at federal pedestrian crashes and fatality rates, and we've actually mapped that. That is now something that the City Department of Transportation, New York City is doing, other advocacy groups in New York City are doing. We had done this many, many years ago, and we put this into fact sheets, and we said, these are the most deadly intersections in New York City, in the region, and we use that to work with policymakers and members of the public in order to change and implement policies.
Thank you. John.
And I use Veronica's data to avoid certain intersections. I'm John Raskin. I'm the executive director of the Riders Alliance. We are New York's grassroots membership organization of subway and bus riders. We push for better service at affordable fares and ultimately a stronger public investment in mass transit. Let me ask, just so I know for a second who I'm speaking with, how many of you guys live or work in New York City? Okay, good, so a bunch of folks in the crowd. And then whether or not you're in New York, how many people take public transportation to get to work on a regular? Okay, good, very helpful, I appreciate that. So look, public transportation, and this is not innovative, I'll warn you when it gets innovative. Public transportation is, the basis of New York's entire regional economy, right? A $1.5 trillion regional economy all rests on having solid, effective, reliable public transportation, and New York as a center of economic opportunity relies on that public transportation being broadly accessible, right? That people can get where they need to go all throughout the city and region and can do it affordably. But though public transportation is so vital to New York City, our elected officials have been systematically disinvesting in public transportation, right? We've had a series of fights with Governor Cuomo and actually other governors before him in which they have tried to take money out of dedicated public transit funds and use that to fill other gaps in the budget. And so we looked at it and said, why, right? If this is so essential, why is our state government, which is responsible for public transit here, why are they not investing? And what we said is the answer is because in a democracy, or I was going to say a relative democracy, as everywhere is, but we're doing very well. On a broad scale, we're doing very well. In a democracy, our elected officials don't care about the needs of public transit riders 50 years in the future or about these kind of broad, abstract needs of the city. They care about what their constituents are yelling at them about right now. I used to work in the New York State Senate. I was acutely aware of that. And so what we're doing in New York is we're trying to bring in those voices of transit riders in a very kind of nuts and bolts, neighborhood by neighborhood, community organizing way. We go out and we work on winning, repairs to a certain station or improvements to a certain bus. And the idea is not only to win those little steps toward better public transportation, but also to build a political constituency out of transit riders who can then go to their elected officials and demand the funding and the legislation and things that ultimately are going to make service better. And so we can talk in more detail about that later, but what we're trying to bring to add to kind of the world of advocacy that our colleagues work in is that sort of neighborhood by neighborhood grassroots organizing of transit riders to make our political system more responsive to that constituency.
Michael?
Thank you. So I'm Michael Sorkin, and I'm here on behalf of a nonprofit that I direct called Terraform. And we've been engaged in a kind of thought experiment for the last half a dozen years involving the complete redesign of New York City in order to find out exactly how autonomous, how self-sufficient the city can become. And we've broken our research into a series of respiratory functions. We've now more or less finished our work on food. We're almost done with waste. And we're moving into movement systems. So I show you some preliminary findings and areas of investigation from this research, perhaps. Huh? Oh, okay. Yes. So I think the first and most important observation about innovation in transit is to stop innovating on the supply side of transit and start innovating on the demand side. So one of the things that we've looked at is the way in which New York City neighborhoods can become far more autonomous. After all, if you can walk to work and to culture and to school and to recreation, then you've solved the transit problem on the demand side. So we think that the creation of mixed-use neighborhoods is step number one, not only for a rational transportation policy, but also for a rational social policy. Because if everybody in the neighborhood can walk to work, that means that everybody who works in the neighborhood also has to live there. So we're looking at the scale of neighborhoods. We're looking at the scale of highly mixed-use blocks in order to see on how small a compass these radical mixings of use can devolve. So there is a highly mixed-use block. I think that I am in agreement with other speakers and everybody in this room and everybody in New York that pedestrians are the alpha mode of circulation in cities and on the planet. So we have been looking in particular at Upper Manhattan, and when I say pedestrians are the alpha mode, that means they must be served with glorious connections. So here is a new network, what we're calling a parkapelago, a series of exclusively pedestrian spaces on Upper Manhattan. Here is, this is something that started as a riposte to the Columbia Plan. Here is how it sort of devolves on Manhattanville. Here is something called the Science Walk that goes from Columbia to Harlem Hospital and aggregates, or I should say disaggregates, a series of science-based institutions based on a pedestrian spine. Here's its point of origin at the Hudson River. And here is a kind of carving up of an existing apartment building to make what we're calling the Hispanic steps of Manhattanville in order to allow a much freer flow of pedestrian traffic from the Columbia expansion into the surrounding neighborhoods. I think it's absolutely vital that we radically reorganize the space of the street. You know, I've been writing letters to mayors since before you were born, suggesting that it would be sound policy if we were immediately to transfer 50% of the space of the street into the pedestrian realm. We would solve all sorts of problems. You know, what do you do with the waste? Places for kids to play, various solutions to the urban heat island, all sorts of things could happen if this rebalance were to take place. And this, after all, after parks, is the largest area of space in public ownership in New York City. And to use it for the storage of private vehicles and the circulation of dangerous motor cars seems absolutely stupid. So here are a few, Amsterdam Avenue, as it will soon be, in which you can see that there's an absolute priority to public transportation. There are a few benign mechanical modes on the left, and the happy urban farmers, 125th Street, as it will be. This is part of another scheme that we've been working on in Queens that's about a figure ground switch in which the buildings move into the street and the interiors of the block become agricultural areas. Here's another cross-section of a street in Harlem, something in Lower Manhattan. The subway, somebody brought up the idea of freight. One of the ideas we're working on is, I don't know, that slide is there, is the idea that the subway is a logical means for the distribution of freight in the off hours throughout Manhattan. So this is an image of one of our will feed 40,000 people vertical farms located over the subway. Not much new infrastructure is needed, sidings, a way to bring goods to the surface, some benign electrical tugs to distribute produce and other freight locally. And we took a look at Lower Manhattan in terms of like innovations in terms of ganging freight by the water and by subway stations, and then distributing it locally in the off hours via these little electric tugs. And finally, we're looking at the use and misuses of existing infrastructure and the ways in which it can be recovered. This is you know, the Riverside Drive viaduct made into the higher line. You know, we did the traffic numbers. There's plenty of space for this. Here is a kind of a serendipitous intermode where Amtrak, Metro North, the new 125th Street tram, the #1 train, and the new ferry service that's coming to the Columbia campus could be easily consolidated at relatively low expense. Here's a much better use for the space above the Long Island Railroad. Again, we can feed 100,000 people with these buildings. We did a project to scrape off the automobile infrastructure from the Brooklyn Bridge and largely pedestrianize and bicycleize it thus. And you know, this is how Lower Manhattan could look if we do the easy thing and close down the East Side Drive. Innovative?
Oh, I can see this is going to be a fun panel. So I guess so what we have on the table now is innovation in theory and innovation in practice. We will come, I also very much appreciate the supply versus demand side dimension that you've brought up, and we'll come back to that maybe in our third round, but I want to still play or put on the table the idea of innovation in theory versus practice. It seems to me, of course, the concept of innovation is old and tired, and it holds, you know, everything under its umbrella, right? But one way to think about, we often tend to ceremonialize the concept as implying some kind of like breakthrough, maybe even disruption, maybe not, maybe that's why the concept of disruption is now all the rage. But I guess I wanted our panelists to think a little more about kind of the radicality of the innovation, even in practice. Let's not get to imagination yet. For example, I would like to hear from our panelists whether you would see what you're doing as a version, this is purposely polarized, but a version of tinkering with the system versus shaking up the system with your innovation. And that will hopefully help you share with us a little more about the who's in the system that you're maybe challenging and the politics of doing that. Have you run into political obstacles? And I can imagine in either, whether you're tinkering, you might still run into obstacles, or whether you're shaking up the system. So I'd like to hear a little more about that, not just with respect to your innovations, but whether understanding those two ways of those two sets of constraints or two ways of innovating had any bearing on the innovation that you chose to try to implement. So kind of really getting more material on how you understood the political constraints in which you were operating. Frank?
So I mean, we're building tools for urban planners to use. And I think there's this kind of amazing shift going on in planning where it wasn't very long ago that only a few people had access to aerial photographs. So an aerial photograph was like an amazing, rare thing that you would look at and it would be really big. And maybe you go to the library, but if you're a planner, you got a set of aerial photographs and you could use them. Now, everyone right now on their phone could be looking at an aerial photograph rather than listening to us. The same thing applies to sort of all aspects of the planning toolbox. All of the technical tools that used to be monopolized by planners are now extremely accessible. And so that means we can do things inside planning offices or in community organizations that were just completely unfeasible before. And so I see projects like the bike share collaborative input, where you're getting 10,000 data points and you're hearing from 60,000 people. That's just the beginning of a complete reshaping of how information goes into planning projects and how it gets used. We can do things now that were completely unfeasible, like follow up with people who come to a public meeting about the specific topics that were heard at their table in the public meeting. So things that in the past you maybe were lucky to read a report that was written for one audience. The idea of a single report from a planning project, completely different. You could write a report that varies depending on who's reading it or where they're reading it or why they're reading it. So I think we're just at the beginning of this amazing time of the tools that planners have being much more widely shared with people who aren't planners, thankfully. And then the things you can do with those tools are just sort of mind-blowing compared to where we were a few years ago.
But let me push you a little. I'm not clear whether that's tinkering or shaking up the system. I guess so. We need to hear a little more about what is the kind of democratization of those tools done to the planning profession or the public sector. Is there noise, pushback from anybody? Not that that's the only thing that matters in an innovation, but if people yawn when it happens, I don't want to say they yawn when it happens, but if it doesn't create a controversy, is it worth investing your time in?
So I mean, I think that the nature of community input is that it does feel more like tinkering than disruption. I don't think anyone would say, we want to hear from New Yorkers about bike share, but in order to do so, we'd like them only to contact us through Facebook, right? So I think there's a sort of an easing into these tools, but at the same time, the idea that you can collect that much information and you can use it. So I'll give you an example outside New York. I'm sorry, I know that the framing is New York, but Philly just wrapped up getting public feedback on 95 potential locations for their bike share system. And they used one of our maps and they used a text messaging service called Text2Zen. And they collected 10,500 very detailed surveys about those 95 locations that they can then cut down to the 65 that they're going to install. And so this is a level of input and a level of detail. This isn't just open-ended comments. This is a multiple-choice survey about why you think this is or isn't useful. That, again, is just sort of inconceivable. So I think just the nature of the way that we use tools is gradual, but the change that is going to happen with each successive wave is going to be more and more exciting.
Thank you. Turn on to Veronica.
We are primarily an advocacy organization, so if what we're doing does not provoke controversy, then we're not doing our jobs well enough. Transportation policy is what I work on, and the important thing about transportation policy is following the dollars. You have to know where the money is going. It's a little different, let's say, than the environmental realm or environmental policy, which is about regulation and stipulation and laws and policies. Transportation policy is a little different. You have to know how money is being spent. And the radicalization of it comes when you're making the everyday person the expert in his or her community, which is a radical idea to transportation agencies and transportation departments, where engineers with 30 years of experience don't want to be challenged in their paradigm for how to design our communities and how to improve mobility. So when you're following the numbers and you have the dollar figures and you're giving that to the everyday person and you're making that person the expert, you are challenging the paradigm, you are challenging the thinking, you're challenging the institution. And that is where our work becomes radical.
So, look, let's be honest. No, you know, in the purest version of what we're trying to achieve, you know, we have a narrative that says, before, the elected officials didn't care about public transportation, and then we're going to focus their attention on it, and now they will. And that's, you know, sometimes when I go out and tout the organization, right, I try to frame it in those terms. But in reality, you know, among the 100 of you strangers and me and the webcast that saves this conversation forever, in reality, progress is incremental, right? The public policy is sticky, right? It's slow to change. You know, as Veronica said, we try to provoke change and we try to push in a certain direction, but in reality, it's slow going. And I think that constitutes a certain tinkering that no matter how well we do, you know, these things happen step by step, and they take time, right? No matter how well we do our job, they take time. But I would also say another thing is that, you know, another way in which we say we're radical, but in reality it's incremental, is that we're not the only advocacy organization in town, right? What we're trying to do is organize transit riders to bring value added, but we're not bringing value added to nothing, right? Veronica, you know, runs an organization that does fantastic work, and Paul Steely-White in the front row, and there's a crowd from Regional Plan Association, right? There are folks working on related issues and working on public transportation, and when I saw Kate from Strap Hangers sneak in, but right, these are folks who do good work that what we're trying to do is support and bring new power to, right? We're playing a power game. It's about organizing transit riders to become a powerful force, and the intention is to use that power, I would say, in a couple of ways. One is to win more kind of public attention and focus on the needs of public transportation. But the other is to add some kind of force and some emphasis and some oomph to, you know, the policies that our allied organizations work on, right? And I know many of you in the audience here are engaged in research and, you know, kind of work on policy issues. The idea is to be able to kind of add some force to the implementation of those good ideas, right? The ideas that you have may be revolutionary and radical, and what we're trying to do is kind of create a political infrastructure, an incentive structure, so that some of these good ideas will, you know, have an easier time taking root. And so, you know, the pitch is radical, but in reality, this is incremental, and I think that's actually kind of okay.
Michael.
I certainly think that this idea of innovation has to be interrogated with a concept about what is a good city. What are we innovating on behalf of? Which leads me to the second conclusion, which is that I don't think that we can talk about physical mobility without talking about social mobility. And when these are merged, we are obliged to question a lot of assumptions about the way we have historically planned and the way we continue to plan. So the planner's default, even today, and almost universally, is an idea about zoning. Zoning by use, zoning by class, zoning by race, zoning by a variety of measures that tend to militate against the idea of a city of radical mix. And I think that if I have an idea about the good city that I wish to promote, it is the idea of a city that is completely accessible in terms both of one's social possibilities and in terms of one's physical possibilities. Whether this is an innovation, I'm not sure. I know that, you know, I've been thinking about movement and mobility for a while, and what got me started thinking was a trip to India maybe 25 years ago. And the experience of a street in India, which I completely romanticize, peace, brothers and sisters in the back row there. But what I saw was this street of all modes. And now we talk about shared streets and Hans Monderman and all this kind of strategies for mixing things up in one space. But there it was in India, you know, from building front to building front, every possible means of motion was mixed, you know, cars, trucks, ox carts, rickshaws, tuk-tuks, And of course, the guarantors of the system, the cows, and I've also written letters to the mayor suggesting that 10,000 head be let loose on Park Avenue. But it struck me that there was something radically democratic about this system, which is to say that it demanded for participation a kind of negotiation. So the idea was that you couldn't simply cross the street. This is contrary to our Western style of traffic planning, which is all about lamination and separation of modes and privilege going to the most energetic, blah, blah, blah. This was about, greeting the elephant and saying, I defer to you, or the elephant deciding to let you pass. And somehow this model has stuck very much in mind as an image, not simply of a strategy for mobility in the cities, but as a way of imagining a city radically mixed, in which strategies of deference and cooperation superseded strategies of isolation and restriction as formative of the idea of what constituted a good urban place.
Well, I have one more question I'll ask, and then we have two commentators. We're going to be joined by Sarah Kaufman and Paul Steely-White, but just let me do one more round. I guess let me just apologize to the panel for being flanked by an urban designer and an urban sociologist and a design school, both of whom think about the city as a whole. It's obvious in Michael's response, and in most of my work, I also think about the city as a whole. And I've been thinking about this panel, your responses, the whole discussion today, the kind of tension between thinking about the city and thinking about transportation. And obviously, in the ideal, we want to connect those things, whether it's through land use, et cetera. But I feel like we're not there yet. We're not necessarily talking to each other yet. So my question, thinking, through the lens of the work that you do, I have a question for you three, and then one for Michael on the same line of thinking. What are the how does the city, the understanding of the consumption and the place in the city as a whole, the entire urban experience, work into, if at all, in the kind of advocacy and work that you do? I mean, I want to see whether on your part, from the perspective of the citizens that you're working with, how they understand, whether they get involved with you. I'd like to know from the trenches how that connection works. And the question for Michael then is a little more, to push you a little more about the most appropriate scales for intervention to create this city of radical mix. And we saw many different scales of intervention. This morning there was a really interesting commentary by Gita, where she laid out kind of three scales: the streets, urban design, and planning. Not quite so much of physical scales of intervention, but like scale domains with some physicality to them. In our profession, and to solve the problems that we're all concerned about, we want those things to work together, but you kind of have to start somewhere. So my question to you, Michael, is about which of the scale you'd intervene in first and why. But it really has to do with thinking about creating the city of radical mix, creating the city as a whole. So that'll be my last set of questions, but go ahead.
So I think the tools that we work on enable community involvement. I think the thing that's very easy to forget when you work for a particular city department or a particular division with a city department is that people outside of cities don't see, oh, this is a streetscape meeting, so I should limit my feedback to streetscape issues. Mm-hmm. Right? So most people in cities experience the work that a city does across all of the silos that we're very sort of constrained in. So maybe a lot of people, if you walked outside and you asked someone to explain MTA funding, they probably would not be able to give you, I probably wouldn't be able to give you a particularly coherent answer. So I think the potential of the kind of tools we work on is that they make the process of getting involved much more seamless. And so you don't need to know that this particular piece of feedback needs to go to sanitation, or that this particular issue is a zoning issue rather than a regulation of uses issue in a different way. Like there's potential to sort of wrap the complexity of all of the bureaucracy of a city in a very enjoyable, easy to use, sort of unified face that people can engage with.
Thank you. Veronica.
One of the challenges of advocacy is taking a complex issue and bringing it to the general public and making it resonate with them in a way that they feel a connection to. And transportation funding is not really that kind of issue. It's the kind of discussion that makes people's eyes roll back in their head and they, want to put their fingers in their ears. It's not an easy conversation to have, particularly because the general public feels that the transit agencies and the transportation departments have lots and lots of money, and the transit agencies and the transportation departments feel that they don't have nearly enough money. So we have to find that intersection in between the two and make it a relevant conversation for both, where we're explaining the real problem in the most objective, pragmatic, easy to understand way. And that is, again, one of the key challenges of advocacy. In New York City, we are a city that is dependent, reliant on our transit network. In many ways, that's taken for granted. In many ways, it isn't. It's taken for granted in the sense of the funding scheme, because when it comes to paying for that transit system, and the we is a large collective we. It's not just transit riders, it's businesses, it's drivers, it's manufacturers, and those that represent all of those interests, those being the elected officials from the governors down to our mayors and our state elected officials. We don't want to pay the true cost of what our system is, what our system costs. Though we rely on it and we understand that when that system is shut down, our livelihoods and our economic opportunity and our quality of life is greatly diminished or destroyed. So being in the cities, we have a wonderful captive audience in New York City that understands the importance of transit. But bridging that gap, making that connection to the investment and why it's important to continually invest, why our transit network and our transportation system more broadly, we're talking about roads and bridges, our existing infrastructure that complements our transit system, why that investment is so critical and so important. And being in cities makes it a little easier because, again, we have that shared knowledge, but we still have that insurmountable hurdle many, many times of getting the point across for why this infrastructure investment is so significantly needed.
So, we're trying to win better transportation policy in New York City, right? At the end of the day, that's the focus of our work. But what I spend most of my time thinking about is neither transportation nor New York City. It's Veronica. No, it's a knowing giggle. No, it's neither transportation nor New York City. It is people and relationships between people, right? Our theory of change and what we bring to public transportation is to say that this high-level public policy decision-making is not actually really rooted in the best policies available to people of the day, right? It's rooted in political actors and decision-makers and their self-interest and what they're looking to achieve in their own careers and their own lives and with the power that they hold. And so, what we do is try to connect transit riders, that's our constituency, with their elected officials in a way that kind of changes the incentive structure so the elected officials will think that that's a constituency that they'd better serve, right? And the idea is that that then leads in turn to better public policy, right? It leads to the implementation of some of the ideas that we've talked about today, not all the ideas we've talked about today, but some of the ideas we've talked about today and some of the ideas that I think the folks in this room would generally concur is better policy than what we're doing right now. But looping it back to kind of the original question, we're trying to build those connections and make those relationships and kind of connect those people. That only works if people do feel a sense of community and interaction and engagement between each other, right? A city full of a bunch of autonomous individuals who have no connection to each other make for a very poor grassroots organization. And what we found, to be honest, our model is to build neighborhood by neighborhood to then build up a broader constituency for public transportation and communities where people really identify with their community, where there's a sense of place, right? Where people know who their neighbors are and have those opportunities to interact and form that community are much more engaged communities when it comes to interacting with elected officials and kind of winning public policy that better serves the community. And so even though the community making and the relationship building that we do is really kind of in the political realm, in the policy realm, it really does have a direct relationship with community making at the neighborhood level and at what we would ordinarily refer to as the community level. And so these are, there is a complex interaction, but we doing our community building really rely on people who make places and people who build communities at the local level.
Thank you. Michael?
Let me demur slightly with Diane's characterization of the way I think. It's true I think about the city as a whole, but that's not all. I mean, and I appreciate, the special tenured professor's question, just for me. So let me use a tenured professor's word, which is, it's a kind of epistemological problem that Diane has brought up, and the question is, how do you think about the city? We certainly are coming from a period where thinking about the city as a whole is considered to be a very dangerous thing indeed. We have the legacy here in particular of Robert Moses, we think about Baron Haussmann or Speer, and the idea somehow that thinking about the city as a whole invariably leads to fascist tendencies and depression and Big Brother and the deprivation of freedom. That's our received wisdom, and much of it is very true. On the other hand, I am somebody very committed to restoring the discourse of the city as a whole. I think that nothing should be forbidden. We should be able to design whole cities if we like. On the other hand, if we do this exclusively, then it remains dangerous. So I would say thinking about the city as a whole has to be in a, another tenured professor word, dialectical relationship with thinking about the city as a series of fragments. So it's important to think about the bedroom and the apartment and the stairway and the building and the block and the neighborhood and the district and the kinds of people who live there and the kinds of institutions that allow neighborhoods to flourish in relationship as a form of interrogating one's big thoughts about cities as a whole. So, in teaching design, I am very much given to encouraging my students to use one form of thinking to interrogate the other. What would be the consequences of a series of small decisions in aggregation that yielded a whole? What would be the consequences of a big move for a series of little decisions that have to remain autonomous and private to individuals? So I think nothing is off the table, but taking some things off the table in favor of others is where we get into trouble. And again, I come back to the information of ideas about the good city, whether it's about the beauties of the canals in Venice or the loveliness of the Zocalo in Mexico City or the pleasures of riding on a tram through Lisbon. All of these things figure. They're all legitimate points of departure as long as they're governed by some idea of a beautiful, sustainable, and ethical environment.
Thank you, Michael. And if I might, even though I'm the moderator, add that I think that also suggests, at least for all of us here and today, that thinking critically about the scales of intervention, whether you use a dialectic, that it's not a priori given what is the appropriate scale to intervene at to achieve the outcomes that you want. And I would say it's true for all of you too, in terms of how you organize, at what scales do you organize. So intervention, social organization, political organization, et cetera. Those are the open questions, and there's no single answer.
Just to make a little amendment, I mean, we in our work are particularly interested in the neighborhood as a logical increment of both social, political, and environmental organization.
Great. We should stop because we have two other people who are going to be joining this conversation. We're going to start first with Sarah Kaufman, who's a digital manager at the Rudin Center for Transportation, and she's going to make a comment, and I guess ask questions or make a comment, followed by Polly.
I'm Sarah Kaufman. I now have both shoes on. I'm from the NYU Rudin Center for Transportation, and right now our primary work is generously funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you. We are looking at job access across New York City, analyzing New York City's 177 neighborhoods, and how people can access work better through transit, faster and giving them more access to job opportunities. We're finding a great discrepancy between New York City's neighborhoods. Although the city as a whole has great transit, several neighborhoods do not. And those are the ones that we're finding with much lower economic standing. So we're looking at solutions for how we can improve their standing. Which brings me to my first question. And I will say that I had some requests from people in the audience to stir the pot a bit as a segue into the reception this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and take them up on that. In our discussions about orchestrating changes for different neighborhoods, it's a great example to look at the three of you, and Michael, I'll get to you in a minute, in terms of your advocacy work. And Frank, you focus on digital advocacy or digital voices for the population. Veronica, you talk about using kind of paper advocacy and arming the public with information by distilling really complex concepts onto fact sheets. And John, you do a lot of community organizing. My question is, Frank, to put you on the spot, how long until your model of community organizing, community engagement becomes the primary means of communication with constituents, and Veronica and John's models are totally outdated? And will that happen?
I hope not. So no, I mean, I don't think so I've just been reading this novel called The Circle, which I recommend. I think it's a little old, but anyway, it's about a sort of beneficial tech company that takes over the world. So look, I don't think that digital tools are designed to replace any of the things that we're talking about. I think they're something that go in the toolbox alongside all of the other things that planners and community groups do. And the tools on their own are pretty weak. You need everything else that happens to make them useful.
And you can call our advocacy paper advocacy, I guess, for sort of lack of a better descriptor, but we adapt with the times. We tweet that information out. It's on Instagram, it's on Facebook. It's really about the numbers. And what we want to do is put the numbers in people's hands. And as long as people want to have a fact sheet, we'll produce a fact sheet. But it's really about the numbers on the fact sheet. And what the numbers do is really connect with people, in many cases, in an emotional way, and that will never be outdated. So when we're saying that a particular intersection is dangerous or deadly, people are making that connection and saying, that intersection is in my neighborhood, and 68 people were killed over 2 years, and that number connects to an emotional response there, and that will never go away.
Our idea is that our model, which is connecting, kind of forming relationships among riders and connecting them with elected officials, will be relevant as long as there is public transportation and democracy. And even
Hopefully a
Gabe
long time.
Klein,
Yeah.
who, what's that?
Hopefully that'll be true for
Yeah,
a long time.
a while, like a decade. I don't know how long are you guys planning? But I was saying, even Gabe Klein, who knows from both, said that though we have all this great technology, right? Though we have these new systems of transporting people, et cetera, we have increasingly dense cities. We have increasingly populated cities, and having this sort of public transportation network becomes increasingly important as time goes on. And so the idea is that, as long as those factors are in play, we do have to, as Veronica said, we have to adapt to the times. People develop new ways of communicating with each other. People develop new ways of communicating with power brokers and with decision makers and so on. We need to make sure that we're able to take advantage of all the different tools, including the ones that Frank creates. But the core of what we're trying to do, I think, really is a long-term project.
Can I ask you a quick question onto that before I get to Michael? So just bring up from our prior discussion about the riderless car. So when you said, okay, it was a joke, public transportation will be around and democracy will be around for a while, I'm not so sure. I guess it depends on what one's definition of public transportation is, but like the advent of the riderless car and the technology we just heard about in the prior panel, what are the implications of that for your collective work too?
Well, I think one way to think about transportation is through a lens of equity. And when you think about what some of the great equalizers of a community are, our public space and our sidewalks are examples of that sort of democracy and that sort of equity and what we are promoting as equity. So having a car is an equity issue for many individuals who cannot afford a car. So if we're talking about driverless cars and that's the future, then what's happening to those individuals that cannot afford that? So I think, making sure that we keep equity into this discussion of mobility is incredibly important.
I'm going to dodge the question from a totally different angle. Part of what our job is to do is to translate kind of the immediate needs of transit riders into immediate action of decision makers and public officials. And so what we actually end up having to do, right, in the world of transportation, there is lots of innovation, right? There are great ideas, and there are many people out there, and right, Frank is really part of a strong community, even locally in New York, that continually produces strong ideas, right? And Sarah Kaufman at the Rudin Center is, right? You guys, and part of what we have to do, and you know this from conversations we've had together, is we have to let a lot of the stuff that is new and interesting and innovative, we have to let it on the side until the day comes. Right? Because a lot of what we're trying to do is not the vision for what's going to happen 20 years down the road, because it's fanciful to agree, right? It's you guys are generating ideas and you're trying to push the conversation in a certain direction and so on, and we at the other end of the spectrum kind of trying to form policy that's going to happen tomorrow and trying to get the legislature to pass a bill this session and so. We actually have to sometimes work deliberately to maintain a focus. I want to say to deliberately put our head in the sand a little bit and remain agnostic about what's going to happen so far in the future, because the political decision making is so focused on today.
Well, that's a really good point about thinking about the near future and what needs to happen tomorrow versus in the next decade. So my question is, when we look farther in the future, not only are we talking about a change in terms of infrastructure and mobility patterns and information possibilities, but we're also going to likely have to see a lot of change within the transportation leadership and understanding of these and ability to absorb these innovations. So what do you think needs to happen from a transportation leadership perspective for these innovative ideas to take hold? And as a side note, what has been your experience pushing ideas within the New York City scene or more broadly?
So everyone should obviously make plans to come to Transportation Camp in DC, which is a great sort of, but I mean seriously, there's sort of events that bring together, like this does, people who are practitioners and technologists, and gets them sort of leaving their silos and talking to each other. Incredibly important to sort of powering up that next generation.
I would say that we need some new thinkers in a lot of our agencies and departments. And it's great to have longevity and continuity in a lot of these agencies. There's one such DOT in the tri-state region, which I won't identify, but the commissioner of this transportation agency was lamenting, or department rather, was lamenting that there was a huge shift out of professionals in the department who had been there 30 plus years. And this commissioner, again, was lamenting this shift and expressing a good deal of concern. And a lot of the advocates in the room at this presentation were clapping on the inside, thinking, thank goodness, it's time to get some new ideas, some new innovations in. And this is not in any way to suggest that people who have been at agencies and departments for a long time are not innovative. Many of them are, but we are just stuck, again, in a paradigm and an institution that has taken quite a bit of time to evolve with the trends. And those innovative thinkers that exist within these agencies and departments are really fighting a lot of battles in order to respond to what they're seeing and adapt to the trends. So we want to see some new thoughts into these leadership positions.
I say no more thinkers. By which I really mean, I'd say a couple of things matter, right? One is who actually has the power to make these decisions, and on that I don't actually really disagree with Veronica. I think Veronica's 100% right. The folks who are in charge, who's in political office, right? Who's in these administrative roles, right? Running departments. That makes an enormous difference in translating good ideas into public policy on the ground. But the other, coming back to the question of kind of how do you, I know that a bunch of the folks who are here are really more in the kind of idea and research generation end of the spectrum, right? And farther from the kind of gritty, I don't know how many of you guys spend too many evenings at like community board meetings in central Brooklyn. But what I would say is I really encourage, right, there are, and I was being facetious about the no more thinking and no more thinkers, but there are such good ideas, right? There really are. It's not a mystery among especially folks in this room, what are some ways we can improve public transportation? What are some ways we could improve transportation more broadly, or the city as a whole, right? All the different things we've talked about today. And what I really try to encourage my colleagues to do is to, in very practical ways, right, to partner with either organizations like mine, and we try to stay in touch. We're looking for good ideas to turn into policy, and they're looking for kind of people who are on the ground doing policy. And I would just encourage other folks, to think in those terms as well, to think in terms of kind of concrete, practical ways to take ideas and find the folks who are kind of empowered, who are decision makers, and translate that into reality.
Michael, do you have a response before we call it Polly? I'll give you a chance to respond to.
Throw the rascals out. I had the incredibly depressing experience over the weekend. I took a train from Waterbury to Bridgeport. And I got to New York, and I realized how comparatively enlightened and together we are as a movement culture. I mean, here was a train. I mean, for the people on the platform were undereducated, undernourished but overweight, chain smoking. The train smelled of pee. Every town you passed was in decline. One abandoned factory after another. And we have a leadership class that essentially doesn't give a shit. That's the only way I can respond. I mean, I'm very suspicious of this word innovation. I think in the research we do, we never think much about exotic technologies, anti-gravity paint, robots, whatever it is. We have the tools to solve these problems. As my comrades on the panel have pointed out, the issue is exactly one of leadership and concern. It's the fact that politicians are in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry, that they love cars, that that they have, in fact, no ideas but the old ideas, which are pernicious. What can I say? I mean, the other thing, this kind of mystification that's around robot cars, I mean, I'm all for driverless cars, but in the city, the fundamental problem is physics. Everybody shows that slide of, how many cars could be replaced if there were a bus. So the problem with the robot cars is not that it's available on demand, but that it is a way of still trying to max out the utility of an infrastructure that should go away. So, how many robot cars can you get on 59th Street? That's the question. And to mystify this by looking at the kind of marvels of the technology, I think is to miss the point about the nature of movement in cities. One of the reasons we ride around in railway cars is that there are a lot of us. That's why cars don't work. I mean, it has nothing to do with the salary of the student who's driving, in the afternoon. It's basically a matter of physics. Two things can't occupy the same space at the same time on this planet.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for coming up here. I just want to make sure we have, if you want to respond, but I do want to make sure that we have Paul Steely-White come up here. He's the Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives. I want to make sure you have enough time.
Thank you, Diane. I'll be very quick. I know we're short on time. It's been a long day.
No, we have like 20
Oh, are we good? Oh,
you get
okay,
time.
in that
I just wanna
case,
have
let me tell you, we're so lucky in New York to have such a well-developed civil society, advocates here in New York. When I talk to my colleagues from around the country, they're always, I think, more starved than we are for this community that we have. So much philanthropy, so much membership, and we're very lucky. But I think one thing that advocates, it's good for us to remind ourselves that ultimately we are trying to put ourselves out of a job in a way. I think, Veronica, you're absolutely right. There will always be a need to watchdog and, hold the bastards accountable. But in our heart of hearts, if we are truly successful in changing the incentive structure, and we can achieve our fantastical visions, what does that look like? What does ultimate victory look like? I mean, Frank, in a way, you've won in a way in that the city has taken up your innovation and they're using it. Other cities are taking it up. There's a self-perpetuating process of escalating innovation, which is wonderful. But I know you have much bigger aspirations for using technology to democratize the planning process. Veronica, we work together a lot on a lot of the same issues, and we are working for that incremental daily change, but sometimes it is fun and useful to think back or to think out and what would ultimate victory look like. So it's a tough question, and maybe Sorkin, you've already told us what your ultimate fantasy is with those lovely isms. But John, if politicians were accountable to how the majority of their constituents actually travel, and we did have a public realm that reflected, a healthy equity balance in our city, like what would that look like if government were doing this and we weren't doing it as advocates?
Good. So this gives me the same opportunity to pick the fight that I was trying to a second ago. Look, I actually think with a lot of what we do, I don't think there is such a thing as organizing ourselves out of a job, because the issues change, right? There are new ideas, there's new technology, there's new ways of getting around, there's new ways of communicating. That changes all the time, right? And so I don't, I can answer, again, this is my head in the sand, right? In the short term, what it means is not raiding transit funds for other priorities, right? What it means is fully funding the next 5-year MTA capital plan, right? But you see that these are all short term, right? This is not a forever vision, because I think that by the time the next 5-year capital plan is over, there will be new ideas we hadn't thought of that we will want to see as policy, because they will be better for the city and better for transit riders and better for all the ways that we get around. And the fight I was going to pick is that, that I think that some of the folks who are in this world, right, some of my friends and colleagues, have a tendency to sometimes think of politics as being like the weather, right? There's not much you can do about it but complain. And it turns out that there's a lot we can do about the weather, right? But it also turns out there's a lot we can do about politics. And I think that that's a permanent infrastructure, right? I think that, all these ideas that folks have and all these things that we agree would be better policy, I actually think that, the elected officials, I spent a couple of years in Albany working in the state Senate, and I came away thinking the system is totally crazy, but a lot of these people are trying to do a good job, right? And they're trying to respond to the incentives around them, and they're trying to, do well by their constituents and do well by the people they talk to over the course of the day, and so on. And I think it's incumbent upon us, as people who care about the issue, as people who have ideas for how to make things better, incumbent upon us to go demand that of our elected officials. And I don't think that's something we do this week and then we call it a day, right? I think that there will be new elected officials, there will be new ways of thinking about this, and it's our job to continue doing that in smarter and better and stronger ways indefinitely into the future. So that's my career plan. It is not a 2-year plan, I am hoping.
Our battle is so large, and we are at the very beginning of this battle. If you really think about when federal policy started to think about multimodalism, it wasn't until the mid-90s. If you compare that to the environmental advocacy community, which started in the 60s, we are so way far behind, and which, from a very optimistic point of view, means we have so much more left to do. So to address the point that John made very early about a very incremental approach, that is what we are doing right now. The battle's so large from funding. In New York State alone, we have at least $50 billion in unmet transportation needs that need funding. And that's the floor. So it's not just the funding, it's the perception, the reprioritization of existing funds. It's how we design communities and where we place transportation infrastructure, and what we decide is transportation infrastructure that should take priority and precedence in a community. So we are at the very beginning of this. We have decades more work to do, but there's been a lot of victories. And advocates have to be very positive, not pessimistic, because that is what drives our enthusiasm and our passion for this work. So I am and Tri-State are going to be in this for a very long haul. But I would say victory is where we are not pushing as much. Our conversations become more simple. There's not as much tugging with elected officials and the public. We don't need to make a pitch as hard as we do right now to make those connections for people.
So I think planning a bike share system, it may not have felt like it in New York City, but it's actually a very easy thing to do. It's not there, you show up, you install the docks, it's a new thin layer of infrastructure on top of everything else. It has a lot of impacts, but it's an easy thing. And the trade-offs involved in deciding whether or not you replace a parked car with 12 bicycles is not a big trade-off. So the end goal of using these same tools within community organizations and within cities to plan everything else is where we're headed. And that's extremely difficult because you get into much more complex geographic scales, you get into different time scales. There's a lot more at stake in a lot of planning. And we have to work out how to build the kind of tools that can help make that easier to get involved with. And then for the people who do want to really dive in and get really involved, help their work with these kinds of tools, as I say, outside of cities and on the inside.
Yeah. I was just going to say that it seems to me, I mean, those are all great answers. Pardon? Did you want to say something, Michael?
Needs to give his answer.
Oh, I'm sorry. Tenured professor, please give your answer.
He's not putting himself out of a job anytime
Oh,
soon.
distinguished area, excuse me.
So I arrived late, and I came at the end of the last session, and one of the comrades in the audience was asking a question about what is the relevance of all of this to the rest of the world, and that's why we're not going to be out of a job. The urban population of the planet is increasing at the rate of 1 million or 1.5 million people a week. Half the population of cities lives in slums, basically dependent on informal styles of both construction, movement, and employment. And I dare say, once we've dealt with New York, there will be plenty of problems still to mend.
Yeah,
I mean, given the enormity of that challenge and, increasing urbanization and the painfully slow incremental process by which innovation is ultimately taken up by the powers, I mean, how can we accelerate that process? Maybe that's a different way to ask the same question, but is there a way, what's your favorite preferred method for accelerating that? Mine is to do away with, we'll have term limits on community boards, so you don't get the same, retrograde, car-centric folks from back in the day. That's a small one, but
Maybe we should have a planning commission who would actually listen to community boards.
Well, I was also going to say that it seems to me, especially listening to Frank, I like that very much. And all the panel, the idea of what does victory look like? Obviously, it's ongoing struggle. There's never an end, right? But victory could be coming to the point where you're willing, able, and capable of leveraging transport to the other sets of concerns that everybody cares about: equity, sustainability, land use. I mean, you can't do everything all at once, but the great thing about transport, it is the absolute entry point into that. And victory would be moving beyond just the isolation of transport and thinking more about the demand side and not just the supply side, as Michael said. So,
if I may just quickly, there's, I think, some positive signs that the current city administration might be moving towards that in some way on, Queens Boulevard, as Veronica's work has shown, is just the most dangerous corridor in New York City by some measure. And at the same time, there's an enormous opportunity to change the zoning and create a lot more affordable housing and, stoke some community development. And historically, these two things have never been thought about together, the streetscape and, economic development, land use. And there seems to be some signs that's changing now. So I think that's very encouraging.
yeah, that's great. Why don't we have a few, let you finish, and then we'll have some questions from the audience.
Just
please, Veronica.
one quick thought or response to what Paul asked about accelerating this process. I think one thing to do would be to, as much as possible, depoliticize transportation funding. Remove the politics. Transportation funding right now is a political problem. But if you remove the politics from that, it becomes an easier problem to tackle.
Not going to happen. But
It happens in some ways.
We have you want to stay up here? That's fine. You can answer some of the questions here too. We have some questions from the audience.
Dinesh Mohan from Delhi. I have a question for John. Everything you're doing, you want to do, it seems that everything else we are discussing is against you. Because I live quite close to work, and I feel so happy when I hear of people stuck in traffic, when the train breaks down. I just met someone who lives in Westchester. If there was no fast transport, he wouldn't be living with 3 dogs and 4 cars in Westchester. So good transit is against your policy. And traffic jams are solutions for your policy. Because if there were no traffic jams, then why should I use public transit? So how do you deal with this? Because the solution for your kind of city is not to have too much public transit and cars not move and poor people be allowed to live all over the city. So how do you achieve that?
Amartya Sen has written that book called The Argumentative Indian. I think the next volume is called The Ironic Indian.
John, would you like to answer? And then I'm thinking, I see a lot of hands up, so we'll collect questions, but maybe just since he was focused exactly on you.
Well, the most important is to ask you not to do our messaging as an organization. But no, I don't really. I mean, I appreciate the comment you make and the kind of, your somewhat ironic and creative way of thinking about it. In reality, as we actually go neighborhood by neighborhood and talk to folks who are taking the subway and bus, it doesn't come up, right? That's not actually the focus of folks on the ground and what they're talking about. And so, though it is kind of fun to talk in those ways and think about it with ideas, people, moment to moment, day to day in the job that we're doing, people are really focused on their immediate needs and kind of what's going on, and there is no trouble that we have convincing people who are on the subway and bus in New York that there is improvement to be had.
But there is a serious vein in this question, and that is the kind of elasticity of tolerance for inconvenience. There's a phrase in the real estate industry which is drive until you qualify. So, if we mystify the idea that everybody has to have a single-family house on an acre of land, and the city grows and grows, and the affordable periphery gets farther and farther away, it simply reinforces the idea that a car is indispensable. So until we change some consciousness, I'm afraid this will only get worse.
We had several hands up, so if you put your hands up, because there are 2 people with microphones, one on this side and one on that side. Yeah. So let's take, how many hands are there? Like 4? If we can take those 4 questions, because, and if you don't mind, and then we'll have some around from the panelists. Henry.
Okay. Harry Dimitrov from the Omega Center at UCL. Can I just, and going back to, Diana, your question earlier on about are you tinkering or is this a paradigm? Let's just for the moment think that was all tinkering. Let's just for the moment think that this is different ways of designing the deck chairs on the Titanic. And there are some very nice designs for deck chairs. Let's try and think that as we talk about values of equity, values of using infrastructure to link communities together, as we talk about environmental concerns. This is the language of the 20th century of the Enlightened. The real developments out there with neoliberalism is actually to make infrastructure the difference between one competitive city, region, and another. Is not to have concern about communities, but to have concern about the markets. Now, get me right, because I want to walk out the door in one piece. I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying that there is a thinking out there backed by funding. Now, if we go further, there's just a scenario which some people would argue is pretty articulate and powerful. If there are thinkers with high-level financing, with contagion funds that go global, and if we are told and believe, as we have been in the past, including by the World Bank, that our public sector is incompetent, corrupt, and unable to deliver what's needed, and we actually need to turn to the private sector, and then when we turn to the private sector, we find that our professionals in the public sector have deserted to the public sector to the private sector. We then find that a dependency relationship comes into play with global infrastructure investment, with sovereign wealth funds, parties we don't even know who own these investment funds, and we go to them for funding our infrastructure. We then find ourselves actually in a situation where much of your innovations become redundant because that information is not going to be transparently available. And just to close that, because I'm very patient, even today, when we did our research on the CTRL, Channel-Town Rail Link, we could not gain access to the information because it was confidential information to the market. So I think that this is all well and good, don't misunderstand me, but we actually need to look at that paradigm shift because it's happening, and it's happening in India, it's happening in London, it's happening everywhere, but we don't actually need to land up there. So my question is, are you tinkering under those circumstances, or is there a paradigm shift? And if there isn't a paradigm shift, how do we prepare ourselves for it?
Thank you. There are a couple questions, and you realize you stand between us and alcohol at the reception, so. But can I say about Harry's, you're not going to get an answer, I already asked the question, but what you've laid on the table for tomorrow maybe is thinking about the experience in New York in comparative and historical context. You know, what New York is doing is part of a competitive city strategy, so we can come back to that. But there are like Onesimo, I think, and then Elliot, and then one more here. Oh, yeah, please. Keep the question short if possible.
I'll try. It's tough with this group, though. I'd actually like to combine, though, what Michael was saying with the rest of the panel, because I think the motivating point has to be what is a good city. And I think that what we're seeing with the sort of advocates is that you are reaching people, but when you say 65,000 New Yorkers participate in citing bike share, you know, that's far short of the 8.3 million people that live here. And so that's not contributing to social mobility. That might be exacerbating problems that we've had with previous methods that have existed for the last, you know, century or so. So, I mean, I wonder how, and I think all the advocates are interested in these things. I'm not trying to take the wind out of their sails. They do great jobs, all of them. But I do think that, right, how do we get more people involved? I mean, if we don't think about social mobility, people aren't going to want to participate in these processes. And, you know, I'll close with this, but I was recently at a presentation from the DOT about their Vision Zero outreach, and they showed a very illustrative map of all the people that participate are in the areas where there's there's very little traffic accidents, but all of the places where there are a lot of traffic accidents, people don't participate. And, you know, if we don't think about what is a good city, we're not going to figure out how we make actually very good transportation systems.
Onesimo, and then Elliot, and then, yeah.
I wanted to ask about how is the role of transportation advocacy changing? And throughout the morning, we heard how you know, the vehicles, the technology that we use to move around cities is evolving. And we've heard how transportation planners and decision makers in cities are actually changing, at least to some extent, their paradigms. So given that the transportation advocacy groups in New York are certainly a reference point for advocacy groups in other cities of the world, I would be very interested to hear how do you think that your role is actually changing from a period in which you were giving information to people so they were able to make claims to the state to an era in which perhaps you are helping authorities implement things that might be controversial among the people?
Thank you. Elliot.
Okay, I'm not sure if I have a question or that was the question. The question I had for all of you was, there's something very rational about what you're all doing. You're saying that if we could get the information to people, if we could make them have an accessible, understand accessibly what the transportation funding issues are, if we can get the riders organized to, and we could change something, but what is the thing, who are the things or the thing that's going to be changed? It seems to me that we're assuming there's a rational authority up there who will take our information in, you know, like, you know, say, Supreme Court justice, and judge it. And the reason I asked this question, I've spent my life on this side of the. I started out fighting highways in Boston, so this is goes way back. But there's something I don't think you have to answer, but I'd like to put this out there, and for tomorrow perhaps. When we push on advocacy, who are we advocating to?
I think there's one more question here, and then we'll let the panelists respond. They're getting to the end, yeah. I don't think I missed anybody.
I'm Jiang Yuning from China. Actually, I think the innovation, and David, Professor Hobson said, I think that's a difference between the people want to drive in. I mean, Like in New York, I think the pedestrian, and yesterday I have walked through the lake. That it's attracted me is to very quickly to locate where I want to go. That you name the street and avenue. Make it simple to people to understand the transportation. I think that's the one of the innovation. Thanks a lot.
Okay, I think, why don't we give the panelists an opportunity to respond, reflect to the comments, the questions, just the afternoon. Fred, we'll start with
Sure.
you.
So I mean, I'll say two things very briefly. So, these things work at different scales, and I think that to our friend at the back, absolutely hearing from 65,000 people is not as great as it could be. It's a lot better than not doing it, and I would strongly sort of object to any characterization of these tools as disenfranchising people or concentrating power into the hands of a few people. I think if they're used really well, that is absolutely not the effect that we have. And then, in moving away from tinkering and kind of taking off, in the long term, the things that make an autonomous vehicle possible are going to be shared much more widely than I think we realize among all of us. And so, the fact sheets that Tri-State puts together and spends a lot of time working on, they will have tools that will enable them to transmit that information, to make sense of it, to reach people in new ways that's maybe more effective than the fact sheet has been. So I think it's not that there will be a monopoly on making sense of information and turning it into tools. I think we more widely have an opportunity ourselves to take these tools and to use them in the work that we do.
Veronica?
On the point of tools, I would say a lot of these tools are new tools, and it takes some time for the general public to be, more comfortable with them. Now grandmothers are downloading apps on buses, and 5 years ago that was inconceivable. So I think there's certainly a learning curve that will improve and increase the amount of people who are engaged this way. And to address this gentleman's point, even though many had great points and questions, who's our audience? And I think we constantly ask ourselves that very question given the issue and the campaign, and that is a roving, moving target in many instances. So it is our circle of friends, it's our social groups, it is the elected officials, it's the governor, it's the planner in the transportation department, and it's the engineer, and it's the media. It's how we're talking about this. So it's really everyone, and I hate to sort of be broad, because being too broad is not often very helpful. However, it does change depending on the issue, and it has to be inclusive of everyone, because our transportation impacts everyone's lives daily. So the audience does indeed have to be broad.
John?
I'm just going to loop back. I think this is actually relevant to the last few comments, to one of the points that I made earlier, which is that public policy is about 20% ideas and 80% power, right? And that's true on an immediate local level, and we're talking about equity, and we're talking about kind of transition to democracy, and on a global level with the movement of capital, right? And who's responding to what incentives. And so, look, we can get into this in a number of ways. On a micro level, it means that we as an advocacy organization, I think some of the other folks here, have to be very conscious about who we're empowering when we try to make ourselves more powerful, right? And coming back to equity, that means we have to make a very deliberate effort, if we have a values-based argument about transportation, to make a very deliberate effort to be working in a variety of neighborhoods and serving a variety of communities that are not the people who would most easily, who are most wired, right, who have the most time on their hands to come to community meetings, right? All these things have to be taken into account, and that's the most local level. But in a broader sense, it's just something that I kind of find myself in that position coming out of a political background of really trying to hammer it into some of the folks that I work with, of saying that, these are all good ideas and we know what we want, but the folks who are making these decisions do not care about ideas. They care about their own career, they care about where things are going next, they care about kind of all the things that are on their mind. And if we're not connecting our ideas to those goals of the people who are making decisions, then we're not going to get very far in the work we're trying to achieve.
Forgive me for a very specific answer. We've just elected an administration in this city which purports to be highly progressive. Our mayor was in the jungle with Danny Ortega, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, I think our address should be to hold the progressive feet to the fire in terms of not swallowing the neoliberal public-private partnership Kool-Aid that seems to be insinuating itself on the administration. I mean, this is an administration which has as its hallmark policy the idea of increasing housing affordability. But the only idea that they have for doing it is buying off developers in order to provide this housing. So I think we have a very specific object of our address, which is a city administration full of hopeful signs, promising progressive policies that isn't yet delivering them. So our propaganda goes there.
Well,
I would counter and say that I think the administration's doing a great job in maybe a parallel sense with Vision Zero. You know, the streetscape innovation that Mayor Bloomberg's team executed wasn't so different from the agenda that the current administration has under Polly Trottenberg. What is very different is their policy framework and rationale for doing the streetscape innovations. Under Bloomberg, he was speaking more to what you might term the innovation class, or the policy, or the cultural creatives, or global capital, in the competition of the global city marketplace. De Blasio, not so much. He's all about safety and all about equity, right? And so he's a lot of the same interventions, but with a different rationale, and I think a lot more outreach, a lot more hand-holding, which is expensive in terms of person hours. You can talk to Polly about all the people that now that going to community board meetings that weren't doing it before. But I think the ultimate result has been more buy-in and hopefully an acceleration of innovation moving forward.
Well, I'm just wondering whether Commissioner Trottenberg is going to be upstairs for the reception and we can ask her more about that. I want to thank our panelists and our commentators for a great afternoon.